Welcome back to Arguments Mapped. Today we're going to be looking at a debate between Daniel Dennett and Robert Sapolsky. So Daniel Dennett, as I've mentioned in my last video on the channel, is one of the quote-unquote four horsemen of New Atheism. But he's not arguing for an atheist position here. He's arguing with Robert Sapolsky over free will. Both of these guys have published books on the topic, and yet somehow they still manage to talk past each other. Now, before we get into it, a lot of people, if you look through the comments, are just absolutely dunking on Dennett. You know, they're really hating on Dennett in this one. And even though I might not agree with Dennett's position either, I think we should try to understand where he's coming from. I don't think he's coming from an invalid perspective, but I think he's coming from an unorthodox angle, and he's also using language surrounding the topic in a very unorthodox way. So I've got a new MindMup document open, and we're going to be mapping the arguments as they come. Okay, so just to give a brief summary to the introduction, the moderator is David Malone, and we get into the introductions, and the interlocutors are introduced as such. Robert Sapolsky, professor of biology and neurology at Stanford, just written a book called Determined, and then Daniel Dennett, emeritus professor at Tufts University, and has just written a book called I've Been Thinking. Malone tells us ahead of time what some of the topics that we'll be discussing are, and he just brings up determinism and free will. So already you can tell that we're going with some sort of definition of free will that must interact some way with determinism. Or maybe that's the question. How does free will interact with determinism? We have a very similar structure to the last debate that we did. We have a 10-minute opening statements on both sides, 10-minute rebuttals, and then a discussion time. And for some reason, Sapolsky is starting. But you would think that someone arguing in the positive for free will's existence would start. I said a similar thing in the last debate. I think these debates work a lot better when the person arguing in the positive starts first. That way the first person arguing in the negative doesn't essentially have to straw man the opposing side. But yeah, we're going to do the same thing as the last episode. We're going to map the straw man, and if the straw man is accurate, then it will become integrated into the actual map. All right, so after taking another look at Robert's opening statement, I think we can actually map this in the positive. In the positive in the sense that we can map that he's arguing for the final conclusion of there is no free will. So we can shift our conception of the debate a little bit to look at free will as kind of an a priori assumption. We've actually got like two big claims right out the gate. We have there is no free will, and we also have if we believed in the lack of free will, society would be more humane. He doesn't get around to that second one, but we're going to throw it down just as well, just in case it comes up. And we're going to make Robert this light blue color. All right, here we are. Here's the two ultimate conclusions that Robert is working towards in his opening statement. Although sadly, he doesn't really get to fleshing out this one too much. So one of the first questions that Robert asks is, why do we hold on to this notion of free will? And this is a little bit preemptive. He's kind of assuming what Dennett might be going for, but he says, and he admits, that we make choices and decisions every day with intention. And he says that that's very seductive. It makes you want to make the leap to there being free will. He says that that's a non sequitur. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to map this as an objection. Oh dear, I've just realized why it was changing colors. I was doing this on the wrong version of MindMup. Give me 1 second. All right, we're back. So I'm going to map an objection from Sapolsky to himself. All right, so we're going to have it like this. Ultimate conclusion is there is no free will. The objection to there being no free will is we make decisions and choices with intention. Robert's objection to this being a reason to not believe in the ultimate premise is that this is a non sequitur. And with that, we can move on a bit. I should also mention that he actually grants that we have responsibility. He just doesn't consider responsibility and free will synonymous. So understand that in his model of free will, you still have responsibility, you just don't have free will. And actually, he's a little bit more specific with his objection. It's not just that this is a non sequitur. What he's really honing in on here is the intention. And he's saying that the intention is determined. And then we get a really good example. And I don't know how I'm going to translate this into the map, but his example is two people, and they're going to watch a movie. And they come out with very different reactions. One person is inspired by the movie to essentially give their life to charity, give their life savings to charity, essentially. And the other just really wants to get their money back. They're furious at the movie. They feel that the movie is manipulative and that it's trying to take advantage of people. And he says we need to ask the question, why are their reactions different? What's being alluded to here vaguely, but not explicitly, is that this different in reactions can sometimes be taken as a proof of free will. You know, two people go and they experience the same event. They experience the same set of stimulus, and they respond differently to that stimulus. And the idea is that some people will think that that difference in response is proof of a free will somewhere along the causal chain. And Sapolsky says we need to look at the things that could influence that decision. And we have a load of factors here. As said in the introduction, Sapolsky is a neurologist and biologist, so that is the angle that he's taking to tackle this question. The first thing that he points to is biological factors, such as anger, hunger, pain, sleep deprivation, fear, and then hormonal influences. He points out that if you have elevated levels of oxytocin, you're more likely to be trustful of the movie and the message that the movie is trying to get across. If you have elevated testosterone levels, you're more likely to suspect the creators of the movie of having bad intentions. We get the example of trauma. Trauma makes the amygdala larger and makes you more likely to interpret the movie negatively. You're going to be more skeptical, I guess. And then we go a step back and we get to childhood influences. And this is asking pretty much the same questions, but in your childhood, asking questions about how were you raised, anything that influenced your mental development as a child. We go even farther back to fetal influences, talking about how your fetal life can actually have a pretty substantial impact on your day-to-day life as an adult. Things like if your mother is extremely stressed while you're in the womb, you're more likely to, again, have an enlarged amygdala. If you don't get enough calories in the womb, you're actually more likely to, the example that he gives is go out and get popcorn and not care about the movie. And maybe not even enjoy the movie itself because you'll have less powerful responses to stimulus in the form of dopamine. And then we go back even further and we get to genetic influences. Genes have a pretty significant influence on how you respond to your environment. He highlights a couple of traits like empathy and stress, things that are affected by genetic factors. And then he asks you to zoom out, look at all those causes that he just gave you, and then he says that all those causes are also determined. So you can look at any one cause and you can go, okay, why does the kid have these genes? Well, we understand genes pretty well. We understand how genes are passed down. And since all the determining aspects are also determined, he says, and I'm going to play the quote as well, just because I think he words it better, but he essentially says that there is a continuous stream of determined biology. And he says that there's no room to sneak free will as a causal agent anywhere in here. So let me play that quote.
It forms one continuous arc of biology in which there is not a crack there into which you can shoehorn free will. If it was 500 years ago and somebody said, wow, we just noticed when people get hammered over the head, their behavior changes, the brain may be relevant, that's one thing. We know a ton now. We know enough to present a challenge. Show me a brain, a person who has just done something completely independent of every one of those biological environmental influences I just outlined, and you've proven there's free will. And at this point, we know enough of this biology that the onus is on the free will believers.
All right, there's the quote. I think he puts it pretty succinctly there. So he's essentially saying, even though this debate has been framed that free will is kind of an a priori assumption, and Sapolsky is taking down that a priori assumption, he's saying that we know enough now that it should not be an a priori assumption anymore, that the people arguing on the side of free will are arguing in the positive, and that it's no longer really responsible for them to a priori assume that free will exists. Kind of that the burden of proof has shifted. This is very similar to essentially a secularized God of the gaps kind of thing, except we're zooming in way, way closer, right? And before we pass it over to Dennett, and we're also going to throw some of the stuff that he just said into the argument map, if possible. But before we pass it over to Dennett, let's talk a little bit about how Sapolsky is framing the concept of free will here. He's using free will in a sense that is incompatible with complete determinism. It's also incompatible with determinism plus quantum randomness, like that wouldn't affect it. He's specifically outlined free will as being a causal agent, something that exerts power on the determined world. And he's saying, just look at the causal chain, there is no room for free will here. So a good way to map this might actually be to map all those things kind of as supporting reasons for this here objection. Actually, even before we do that, what we're going to do, we're going to give a sibling node to claim 4, pointing out preemptively that those biological factors are also all determined. All right, let me zoom out a little bit. So this is how I have it mapped. Ultimate conclusion is that there is no free will. This is being objected to by us making decisions and choices with intention. Sapolsky is objecting preemptively to this, saying that the intention is determined by a multitude of factors. This is being backed up by biological factors steer day-to-day decisions in totality, and that those factors are also determined. All right, this is very succinct, but it's also quite dense. Let's move on to Dennett's rebuttal. Okay, now we get into Dennett's response. And instantly, you're going to know some stark contrasts as to the angles in which these people are coming at this problem from. Robert, straight out the gate, says that he believes in both determinism and free will. So he is what's known as a compatibilist. And he goes on to say that the philosophical notion of free will that has developed over the years, which is the definition that Sapolsky is more or less using, is very inflated. He characterizes the philosopher's definition of free will as needing to be completely free of previous considerations and influences. So I'm going to map this as an aside, even though it's doing something really strange, which is kind of fighting over the language. We're going to have over here the notion of free will spoken about by philosophers is bad. The reason that I'm using such ambiguous language as it's just bad is because he doesn't chisel that definition of what it means for this to be inflated. So he isn't incredibly precise there. I suppose I can map as supporting this. Sapolsky's saying that it's inflated. And what he's trying to say when it's inflated is that people are attaching too much stuff to this notion of free will. Ooh, and I can also map the reason why he thinks it's inflated. All right, so we have here his early objection to Sapolsky's notion of free will. Now, something that I'll talk about a little bit later is we have a strange kind of linguistic dogmatism going on here. Both Robert and Daniel have notions of free will that they're not bending. And this is the phrase free will itself. For instance, Dennett kind of throws in, almost as an aside, that, yeah, I agree with you on all that biological stuff. In my personal opinion, that should be a focus. You know, how can you both grant that and yet come to different conclusions after that? That's where I would like to see the discussion be had at. And we do get a little bit of that later. We can actually do another thing here where we can say that because the notion of free will spoken about by philosophers is bad, then Sapolsky's preemptive objection over here to his preemptive objection is wrong because it's using the wrong definition. I say that, but let me test it out. Now, of course, this is going to be implied because it wasn't explicitly stated. All right, so we have a bit of a convoluted chain of reasoning. I'm actually going to zoom out a little bit here. So just so we get the full picture thus far, we have Sapolsky's ultimate conclusion, there is no free will. An objection that he sees coming to free will is that we make decisions and choices with intention. He objects to this objection because the intention is determined by a multitude of factors, mainly biological factors, and those factors are also determined. I just realized I'm mapping this wrong. Dennett is not objecting to this as a premise. Hang on a second. No, Dennett is objecting to this as a reasoning, but I don't know if I can map that. Oh, yes, I can map that. Okay. Here we go. Here's our very silly line of reasoning. I don't mean silly as in, it's instantly bad. I just mean silly as in it looks kind of funny. So, where was I in explaining this? Oh yeah, the objection to these functioning as an objection to the ultimate conclusion. Let's actually start at the bottom here. He says, the philosophical notion of free will says that we must be completely free of previous considerations and influences. He says that the philosophical notion of free will has been inflated. This also assumes something. We'll get back to that. This is taken as supporting the notion of free will spoken about by philosophers is bad. This is supporting that free will and determinism are not incompatible. This is a strange thing because this is actually directly stated, but it being used as an objection to this objection to this objection is not explicitly stated. But that's kind of how it's functioning logically, so I'm going to leave it like this. And yeah, let's look at some of the other stuff that Dennett says. He says free will is a socially evolved system which minimizes those factors of influence, talking about the biological factors. So in saying this, he's kind of saying that, yes, those biological factors are real, yes, they have an influence, but their influence scales with something. And he's going to explain what that something is. He says that we develop skills, and he says that we humans have evolved more self-control. And the way that he wields self-control here is kind of as the ability to rise above those determining factors. Again, there's a lot of stuff that's implicit here. I don't want to assume too much about what he's trying to say, but from context clues, this is kind of how he's using it. And he will later say that self-control and free will are kind of the same thing. He does say something that's a little bit strange. He says that foresight is kind of a proof of free will because he says, look at a tree, a tree starts falling. It doesn't know that it's going to hit the ground or something like that. He essentially says that trees don't have like foresight into the future. Not that they can literally see the future, but that they can't psychologically comprehend consequences because they're trees. Meanwhile, humans over here can understand the consequences of their actions. How this ties into his free will argument, I'm not really sure. It was kind of stated as an aside, and I feel like I'm doing him a disservice if I try to insert it into the argument somewhere. What we can do, however, is just as a note, map Dennett's stance. Alright, so the sticky notes have a bit of a weird font to them, but we have here Sapolsky's free will, which is a causal agent aside from determined or random factors. And then we have Dennett's free will, which is almost synonymous with self-control. It's the ability to rise above deterministic factors. So in a sense, they still do have an actual conflict. That conflict seems to be over the role of determinism. Dennett has this implied notion of transcendence of deterministic factors. Sapolsky says that that notion is not possible with what we know about biology. So then we get to an example from Dennett, and Dennett says that Robert has a driver's license. Dennett trusts Robert with a driver's license, but not certain other people. The reason he doesn't trust those certain other people is because they haven't developed self-control. So remember that self-control, as Dennett uses it, being almost synonymous with free will, is something that develops. He refers to it multiple times as something that evolutionarily develops. For instance, he says that like a billion years ago, there was no free will. A billion years ago, there was still animals, there was still life forms, but he says that those animals don't have free will. In fact, he even says that humans throughout history have been developing free will. He points to ancient cultures and some of like the cruel things that they would do. An example that they use is like burning a supposed witch because of bad weather, right? Here he's referring to a quote from Sapolsky's book. He's saying that the lack of that kind of cruelty in modern society is because we've developed further self-control. The difference between them is Sapolsky would explain that in a different way. Sapolsky explains that in his book as we have further recognized the deterministic aspects of our life, and we now realize that some random woman is not the cause of our bad weather, you know. So Sapolsky says that our recognition of our lack of free will is what causes us to be more humane, whereas Dennett is actually saying quite the opposite. He's saying that as we develop self-control, which he deems similar to free will, then we become more humane. We're actually going to add some more to the notes here just because they're important factors. Sapolsky's free will is essentially a binary. It's not that it couldn't scale, but the important way to view it is a binary. It's does it exist or does it not exist? Is there a causal agent that can be called free will? Dennett, on the other hand, has a scalable notion of free will. So Dennett is saying that the differences that we see now in comparison to ancient society is because we've essentially evolved more free will. So the scalability is very important in Dennett's conception of free will. There's also, just because I know Dennett is first and foremost a philosopher, the way that he's using the language here seems to imply some sort of self-recognition of one's own condition. Right, like how do we transcend deterministic factors? Well, I think he would say something like we recognize that which is determined, and then we can choose to go against the grain, kind of. You know, deterministic factors might be pushing us one way, but we can choose to go the other. And this is Dennett's free will. Even though he doesn't explicitly say that, I think it's important to think that that might be what he's trying to get at here. Just because this definition of free will isn't so, like, crazy, you know, as the comments kind of want to make it seem. It's just really unorthodox. Because when you think about it, a robot could very easily acquire this definition of free will. Some people, because obviously the linguistic dogmatism that is implicit in this conversation, some people will want to define free will in a way that is incompatible with, like, you know, a robot. So that's kind of food for thought. And I know that he does give reasons to believe in his notion of free will, but the reason that I don't really want to map it is because his version of free will is kind of like a tap-in. Like, if you grant this definition, nobody's going to really disagree with you. Dennett's free will would just kind of inherently scale with the mental capabilities of any given species. And Sapolsky isn't really going to object to this, so I don't know. What's interesting is the way that this free will doesn't seem to be fully biological in Dennett's conception of it. He says that some people have, like, significantly more free will. Think about the car driver's example. You know, Dennett says that he wouldn't trust some people just because they haven't evolved, and he uses that word, evolved, more free will, or enough free will to trust them. And I guess this is how, you know, you would say that's deterministic, but Dennett would say, yeah, it's deterministic, because he's using a version of free will that is completely compatible with determinism. So we have something here that sits very uncomfortably with the traditional usage of free will in philosophy, which is that deterministic factors actually influence how much free will you have. And he makes this objection to the traditional conception of free will very explicit when he says that free will is an achievement, it's a skill, and it's not a metaphysical feature. Before he gets done, he throws some jabs in. He says people shouldn't care about Sapolsky's free will. He essentially says that there's no reason to care about that kind of free will. And finally, he pulls one more quote from Sapolsky. Sapolsky is saying that he doesn't believe that there's a logical reason to believe something good could happen to a machine. And what Dennett does is he says, I'm a machine, and I believe that good things can happen to me. And I don't know if that's worthy of really being mapped. You know what? I'll do it. Why not? Okay, so we have here from Sapolsky, there is no logical reason to believe morally good things can happen to a machine. And then Dennett saying, I am a machine and good things happen to me. He's essentially just flat out saying, like, the falsification condition. If nothing else, it's logical. At least that conclusion is logical if you grant the premise. And we will actually see them touch on this more. So they will interact with this. All right, so now we get to Sapolsky's response to Dennett. There's going to be a lot of back and forth here on the quotes of each other being thrown out and the ways in which they're misquoting each other. The first thing that Sapolsky brings up is how Dennett failed to talk about what he says immediately after the quote that he says right at the end about Dennett saying, you know, I'm a machine and I believe that good things can happen to me. Sapolsky points out that right after the section of Dennett's quote that he took was cut off, Sapolsky himself goes on to say that, and I quote, nonetheless, at my very core, I think it is a good thing when we are made to have lives with less pain and more happiness. So Sapolsky is just openly stating his a priori assumption here. And that's something that Dennett agrees with, but like with an aggressive attitude. Before getting into the disagreements, Sapolsky also talks about how they both agree that punishment and rewards are okay, even in an instrumental sense. So even if you manage to like corner yourself in some deterministic nihilism, that there are no morals because everything is instrumental, Sapolsky and Dennett both agree that instrumentally, punishment and rewards still make sense. So I maybe shouldn't have talked as much as I did stating my own opinions about Dennett's stuff, because Sapolsky goes on to say very similar things. He points out that Dennett is kind of, the word that he uses is yoking, so Dennett is like yoking his self-control to his free will and his self-control to evolution, and he's talking about how Dennett has made free will almost this biologically evolved thing, which would mean it's emergent in some interesting sense. But Sapolsky actually goes on to say that the opposite of what Dennett said is kind of true, as people have recognized the many ways in which they actually cannot control something, things that they have no control over, like the weather. They've grown more moral. Sapolsky also points out a leap of logic that Dennett is making that he doesn't agree with. He says that Dennett goes something like this. Well, we don't have control over what implicit attributes we have, like the genetic things, the biological things. But what matters, and what we're going to call free will, is what we do with those attributes. And Sapolsky is saying, no, what you do with those attributes is also determined. And that the way that Dennett uses intuition is, in a sense, that is determined and therefore isn't free will. And he kind of says that Dennett's notion of transcending our deterministic qualities is kind of a myth. He's kind of saying that in recognizing our deterministic qualities, we don't transcend those deterministic qualities. We just become more aware of the ways in which we are determined. Let's take a look at the map and let's see if any of that stuff ties in. He's actually providing reasons for his second ultimate conclusion here, so let's map some of this. So I think Sapolsky's ethical argument here can be summed up pretty succinctly like this. A society that believes there is no free will would be more humane is being supported by, as people have recognized the areas they cannot control, they have become more moral to one another. Now I'm in a bit of a pickle here because Sapolsky already stated his objection to what Dennett said before Dennett said it, and it's right here. The intention and intuition are practically the same thing in this conversation. So Sapolsky stating that the intention is determined by a multitude of factors and that those factors are also determined is already a refutation of Dennett's notion of intuition. I guess I could put Dennett's objection over here. It's kind of difficult to map because in some sense they are just talking past each other, although I do think, in my personal opinion, that Dennett is being a bit more disingenuous than Sapolsky is here, just because of, again, the very unorthodox way in which Dennett is using this language. Even though it's kind of an aside, I'm actually going to map Dennett's distinction between influencing factors and intuition, the what you got versus what you do with it kind of distinction, just so I can map Sapolsky's objection to it. So I have this marked as follows. Dennett says that free will is just what we do with our predispositions. And Sapolsky objects by saying what we do with our predispositions is just as determined. But see, when you look at this, he's assuming that free will can't be determined. So it's just really talking past each other. I'll have the implicit claim here that free will is not determined. I guess part of the reason that I'm partial to Sapolsky here is because think of just how much of a bit of an abuse of language it is to talk about free will that isn't free in any sense. In the same sense that Dennett criticizes Sapolsky's free will as being too inflated, I think Dennett's free will is equally deflated, if not more, because it really doesn't mean anything. His free will just kind of means choice. Also, the word will has always implied something beyond, a determined thing. So now we get to Sapolsky talking about this thing over here, the I am a machine and good things happen to me. And Sapolsky is pointing out that Dennett is essentially going off of intuition here. He didn't back that up with reasons. He affirmed it. So I'm going to add some clarity here. I'm going to say I'm a machine and my intuition says good things happen to me. And then we're going to add an objection to the line of reasoning. This is from Sapolsky. And Sapolsky says here that aligning with intuition should not be taken as an inherent moral good. And he gives an example to support this. He says that if both Dennett and Sapolsky lived 400 years ago, even with the same biology, they would likely believe that slavery is intuitively good. What he's saying with this is that intuition can be kind of like socially influenced. What he's pointing out here is that intuition is not a truth-seeking thing. He talks about the logic that people would use like 400 years ago to justify slavery. Here I am giving these folks a house, providing them with work. All of these were arguments that the common man was making 400 years ago, and that's because to them it appeared intuitively correct. And then Sapolsky brings up another quote from Dennett's book where he talks about like two track runners, right? And one track runner is biologically predisposed to not be as good. Like their genetics just aren't as qualified for running track. And then imagine another person over here that is biologically predisposed to be very good at track. Dennett says that this person over here who's not genetically predisposed to be good at track can overcome their conditions, or should be able to overcome their conditions that they're given at birth to become good at track, given enough time. Now, obviously, I don't think Dennett is talking about people who are born paralyzed, but what he's doing here is he's giving a strong emphasis to the notion that one can transcend, again, their like baseline condition, they're deterministic things. And Sapolsky is making a moral objection to this. Sapolsky is saying that we should not morally look down upon people because he says that there are moral implications in Dennett's quote. He says that we should not make moral judgments on that which is out of people's control. So he's saying we shouldn't be judging the runner who was predisposed to not be as good genetically for track for not excelling and becoming really good at track. And we will see Dennett respond to this usage of his quotation very soon. Okay, so I'm going to have the whole track runner thing mapped like this. Even though this is Sapolsky talking about what Dennett said. So we have Sapolsky's Dennett saying that we can pass moral judgment on those who do not rise above their circumstances because one who is predisposed to be less accelerated in certain fields can often overcome their disadvantage. And Sapolsky's objection to this line of reasoning, not to this premise, but to this line of reasoning, is that seeing as this overcoming is also determined, this is not a fair way to extract moral judgments. Also, this is just unfair to those who are predisposed to be less inclined towards something. Now we're going to get into Dennett's response. All right, so we get a bit of a shorter response from Dennett. He starts off by berating Sapolsky because apparently Sapolsky has misquoted him. He has misquoted him twice. He rants about this for like over 2 minutes, I think. And he's constantly making this joke that I don't blame you because it's not really your fault. They have both misquoted each other multiple times in this discussion, but Sapolsky was a lot more civil responding to those misquotings, in my opinion. But what do we need to know that's relevant for the argument? Well, he says that he doesn't actually endorse the viewpoint that you can extract moral implications from somebody not rising up against their disadvantages. So he says that that was a misquoting, and at the end of that passage he goes on to say, but wait, I don't actually believe that. So we can add that to the argument map. I'm just going to have, I didn't actually say this. And he says he actually rejects the two-factor model that Sapolsky was talking about up here. But I'm not going to negate this yet, and that's because they instantly start talking about this. And it's not so clear as to if Dennett actually rejects this position or not. Dennett goes on to give another quotation of Sapolsky, and this time he quotes Sapolsky essentially saying that here's what so many people consider to be free will, but this isn't actually free will. This doesn't actually prove free will because, and then Dennett just goes on to say, this is proof that you've essentially bought into what the philosophers have sold you about free will, the free will nonsense. And then Dennett just preaches a little bit more on compatibilism, and he actually uses the term compatibilism now. And we don't get too much clarifying of his positions. But Now we're going to go into the open discussion portion, and we're going to begin mapping that. And hopefully they won't be so inclined to misrepresent each other, or they can call each other out quicker so they don't go so far into misrepresentations. All right, so we did actually get some productive exchanges between the two of them, partially due in large part to the moderator stepping in. I mean, this guy kind of saved the day. But anyways, we start off with Robert recharacterizing the two-stage model and saying that Dennett is indeed supporting the two-stage model. His characterization of the two-stage model is as follows. You start out with randomness, and then from that randomness, you essentially get choice. Choice and free will are not synonymous. An important thing to remember is machines make choices all the time. And Sapolsky just says that you need to think about, how did you get there? How did you get to that point of being able to make a choice? Then it bounces over to Dennett. Dennett starts talking again about how self-control and free will evolve. He says something really interesting. He says that some people don't have free will. And then Dennett's definition of free will shifts just a little bit. It seems more to be the recognition of one's position, of one's determinants, maybe. I will say this doesn't jive very well with what he said earlier, that free will and self-control are scalable. You know, if free will and self-control are scalable, I find it hard personally to imagine an actor who doesn't have any free will. So it would seem most likely he's kind of bouncing back and forth between a binary and something that scales a spectrum. And it said that Sapolsky misquoted him twice, but I think he only actually misquoted him once. I think because he agreed with Sapolsky's characterization of the two-stage model and then reinforced that he was buying into the two-stage model. So even though he said he rejected the two-stage model, he goes on to use it for the rest of the discussion. So I'm not going to map that he doesn't use the two-stage model, because that's just not true. Okay, then Malone goes on to ask some clarifying questions, and we get a lot closer to not talking past each other. Sapolsky says a lot of stuff that Dennett might consider free will, but he doesn't personally call it free will, but he says something really interesting, which is that we are the only biological machines that can know our machineness. This is a lot like thrownness from Heidegger, as he outlines it in Being and Time, and how we can comprehend our thrownness. What's more, we don't have a role in our thrownness. We can only recognize it. And then Dennett says something really interesting. He quite emotionally asks, well, Sapolsky, don't you want to take responsibility? And this is a very clear emotional appeal. So we have here what almost feels like a base assumption. He's not making an argument for us having responsibility. He's saying that it would maybe practically be better if we took responsibility. The outcomes might be better. He talks for a bit about how he thinks people need to have this drive to better themselves, and to do that, to have any inspiration to do that in Dennett's idea, you need to give yourself responsibility. And then we get some really helpful clarification from Sapolsky, and Sapolsky points out that there are different definitions of responsibility that are floating around here. So Sapolsky meets Dennett on his definition of responsibility, and he agrees with his definition of responsibility. He just clarifies that his definition of responsibility is a different definition of responsibility. His definition of responsibility specifically is, are you responsible outside of your determinants for actions? I should point out they don't agree completely to what scale that responsibility should be had, Dennett's version of responsibility, because Sapolsky says that with some people, for example, he brings up people born into poverty. People born into poverty are very likely to die in poverty. And he talks about, are these people supposed to feel guilty that they died in poverty? They had it a lot harder if they wanted to make it out of poverty. And that's not to imply that they aren't trying to make it out of poverty. But if you have every poor person trying to make it out of poverty, they're not going to all lift themselves out of poverty. That's just not how economics work. So Sapolsky talks about how we should have at least a pretty good recognition of the fact that these people aren't to blame for their conditions. I think the best way to sum up their positions is they don't fundamentally disagree. They just place different focus Dennett really wants to drive home the point that people can rise above their conditions, and Sapolsky agrees that people can rise above their conditions. But Sapolsky is pointing out the fact that it's not plausible for all people to rise above their conditions, really not even a majority, without forcing others into bad conditions. And he places his focus on recognizing the fact that people born disadvantaged in this world should not feel the weight of the world upon them for not achieving some lofty goal. You know, you're not going to consult someone in a coma for insight on how to cure cancer, and that's not that person's fault that they don't cure cancer. And then Malone goes into audience questions, and the last debate that I didn't map audience questions just because they have very little time to respond, and it's going to be a smattering of like different questions, and they don't usually lead to much clarity. So rather unsatisfyingly, this is kind of what we're left with. A lot less argumentation this time, although I guess we still got quite a bit, and we do have our notes here, which are valuable. All right, so we're going to go over the arguments as a whole, just like we did last time, but first I want to take a little bit of time just to talk about some very prominent themes in this debate. Why was this debate so stagnant? Why did, like, such little progress get achieved? Now, granted, I do think this is a decent way to learn about, maybe if you're not familiar with compatibilism, incompatibilism, right? These two people are pretty well representing compatibilism and incompatibilism, but the phrase that I always use is furthering a discourse, and I'm not really convinced that they furthered the discourse here. And part of the reason is this kind of linguistic dogmatism. And I don't know if that's the best way to describe it, but it's like it's dogmatically attaching a definition to a word and refusing utterly to move from that definition. And I just think that it's really sad when discussions get caught up here, of all places, because you don't really have people recognizing, oh, you know, we're at an impasse because I make this base like root assertion and you make this root assertion, and we disagree on things that you can't argue for. In my opinion, that is the best way to agree to disagree, because if you can't argue over root assumptions, and most root assumptions you really can't argue over that well, then I think it's very easy to respect a person and disagree with that person. And you can both leave the conversation having learned something while still retaining the same viewpoints. But what happens here is you haven't excavated the root assumptions of the interlocutors. You've just found a word that they don't like to modulate the definition of. Maybe rhetorically, definitions of words matter semantically or whatever. How an audience receives a debate is influenced by what words you use to say what, right? I mean, Hitchens is a great example of that. But at the end of the day, you could represent all these words with just variables. You could simply define free will, and you could say, here's variable A, and you could have a definition, and you could have a second definition of free will, and you could say this is variable B. And I think there would be much less aggression in this conversation if they did something akin to that, where they abstracted the meaning of the words from the words themselves. Because then, if anything else, then you have the bare bones necessary to get the argument off the ground of, should we call this free will or not? Which one of these definitions should we call free will? Are they both valid definitions of free will? Words can have different definitions. And then you can talk about, you know, the semantic implications that are forbidding you from changing your definition. You could say, oh, you know, the free seems to be implying something, the will seems to be implying something, and that's why I'm not prescribing this definition to this word, right? But I never see that happen, and it's kind of depressing. So, moral of the story is, if you reach an impasse on vocabulary, that doesn't have to be an impasse. Just abstract the meanings and decide on a meaning and use that. And then you can go decide on the other meaning, and you can use that for the sake of the conversation. You can run through both of them. And if you want to stick to one definition, you guys can talk about, you know, why you favor one definition over the other. Maybe I'll make a video sometime on, like, 10 things not to do in an argumentative discussion, because linguistic dogmatism has to be towards the top, if not the top, for ruining any chance of furthering a discourse. Anyways, now that I have thoroughly attempted to indoctrinate my audience, we're going to go through the arguments. We're going to start off with the sticky notes here. Sapolsky's version of free will is a causal agent aside from determined or random factors, and he's usually using it as a binary. Dennett's free will is self-control rising above deterministic factors. But remember, it's not becoming non-determined. Don't get it confused and say that Dennett's free will is becoming non-determined. It's not transcending deterministic factors. It's largely recognizing the factors. And this is scalable, but he does also use this as a binary later on. I think it would be bad faith of me to say that he was trying to say that using a scalable definition, there were still people who had no free will. I don't think he would say that. All right, we have Sapolsky in the blue and Dennett in the yellow. Remember that. We have Sapolsky's claim, a society that believes there is no free will would be more humane. And he says this is because, as people have recognized the areas they cannot control, they have become more moral to one another. They will become more moral to one another. I would have liked to see them focus on this a little bit more. They do have some things that are kind of orbiting around this that could maybe be attached to this, but again, I think it would be kind of bad faith to say that a lot of those other things that were said directly apply to this. Here we have Sapolsky talking about the two-state model and why he objects to the two-step model. The two-step model, as he summarizes it, is free will is just what we do with our predispositions. And Sapolsky would say what we do with our predispositions is just as determined, and implicit in this is free will is not a mechanical determinant. Now we have here a conclusion by Sapolsky, not his grand conclusion, but he says, there is no logical reason to believe morally good things can happen to a machine. This is a quote. Dennett detracts from this, and he says, I am a machine, and my intuition says good things happen to me. And Sapolsky objects to this objection by saying that aligning with intuition should not be taken as an inherent moral good. And he supports this by saying, if we lived 400 years ago, even with the same biology, we would likely still believe that slavery is intuitively good. Also, remember, Sapolsky pointed out that right after he said this in his book, he also said, nonetheless, I feel compelled to say that good things can happen to me. We have a conclusion by Dennett that we can pass moral judgments on those who do not rise above the circumstances. Supporting this, he says, one who is predisposed to be less accelerated in certain fields can often overcome their disadvantage. And Sapolsky objects to this supporting line of reason, saying that, seeing as this overcoming is also determined, this is not a fair way to extract moral judgments. Also, this is just unfair. Again, I feel like we would have gotten farther in this line of logic if they weren't talking past each other. But keep in mind, Dennett, according to himself, says that he didn't actually support this stance, he was just entertaining it. I'm tempted to say that can we or can we not pass moral judgments shouldn't be rendered as a binary. It might be more helpful to say how much can we pass judgments, but that's not what the debate does, and I'm not going to go into my own arguments right now. Now we have Sapolsky's ultimate conclusion here. There is no free will. He preemptively objects to himself by saying that we make decisions and choices with intention. He objects to his own inference there by saying that the intention is determined by a multitude of factors, and those factors are also determined. And he supports 4 with 6, saying that biological factors steer day-to-day decisions in totality. Now we have Dennett's objection to the inference, and he says that free will and determinism are not incompatible, because the notion of free will spoken about by philosophers is bad, and that's because the philosophical notion of free will has been inflated, and that's because the philosophical notion of free will says that we must be completely free of previous considerations and influences. And thankfully, if anything, they did clear this up. I don't think Dennett would maintain that this is Sapolsky's view of free will at the end, but remember, this was his first rebuttal, and this was his understanding of Sapolsky's version of free will. Overall, in retrospect, if nothing else, you should have learned a little bit about determinism and compatibilism, incompatibilism, and above all, I want the takeaway to be that I hope the next time that you get into an argument about definitions of words, that you choose to move past the impasse, because it doesn't have to be an impasse. That's going to be it for this one. I thought this was a bit of a frustrating debate. I do see myself siding more so with Sapolsky, but I wish they had both done a little bit deeper reading into each other's perspectives before going into this. There's the thing which I will stop repeating about, I wish they didn't dogmatize the language, and I wish they talked about definitions a bit. But if we see the fundamental disagreement here, aside from definitions, The fundamental disagreement would be, where do you place the focus at? I would tend to side more with Sapolsky, but that's just my opinion, and any of you in the comments are free to tell me what you believe and why, and I'll entertain any discussion. So, thank you very much for watching. I also want to thank you all for the positive response on the first video. That was actually quite shocking. Over 500,000 views in less than a week on a channel that I've never really used for anything before. So thank you very much for that. I'll also set a subscriber goal that I'll say until we reach 1,000 subscribers, if we ever reach 1,000 subscribers. At 1,000 subscribers, I will map thoroughly the whole Jordan Peterson versus Sam Harris debate that is over 8 hours. I'll do it. As usual, any thoughts you have on the map, on the debate itself, anything that you want me to map, let me know down below in the comments. I'm going to be doing these probably every week. Next week, it's subject to change, but I'm thinking of doing the Ben Ham versus Bill Nye debate over evolution. And yeah, tell some friends about the channel. Give it a like if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more, and I will see you all in the next one.